Dune Spice Wars, the fantastic new 4X real-time / survival strategy game blend. I'm very much enjoying my time unpacking this game, and a lot of you have requested some early game tips. How do I play through? How do I actually play Dune? How do I set myself up for success? That's what this video is going to target. Now, I can't cover all of the factions in it, obviously, but as I go through, I'll be very conscious to make notes of each and every single one. I've played with them all. I understand almost all of their abilities and effects at this point. I feel comfortable to provide this to you. For the sake of simplicity, I'll be playing as Atreides. They tend to be the most popular and are generally the easiest to play. Their special thing by far and away is that they can annex villages peacefully. Whereas, for example, if you're playing as Vladimir over here, then you might choose to oppress your villagers instead, increasing their production. Playing as the Fremen will net you your sandworms, move around very quickly, don't worry about supply, build alliances with the locals. The smugglers, uniquely, will let you build underworld headquarters on your opponent's villages. Introductions aside, I'm going to jump in as Atreides, and I'm going to choose my counselors fairly straightforward and trying to build a solid early game foundation. The reduced authority cost to annex villages, for example. Brilliant. Another one that I could access fairly early for power could be the extra agents. Maybe I want to force trade deals upon other people by paying some influence to make them take it. There are options here that are available. I'm going to take the extra agents for my espionage. More on that in a minute. When you're setting up your game, first, if you're struggling with the early game, you might want to tone down some of these effects. I'm going to leave them on completely default for this video. First and foremost, as we spawn into this real-time strategy game, you might want to smash the spacebar to pause. However, thankfully, my first sort of recommended early game approach, and this is just my strategy. If you've got more thoughts to add to it, please do throw them in the comments below. But generally speaking, you want to manually beeline your scout, your ornithopter, out towards Spice. You'll generally spawn with a Spice in an adjacent territory next to your sort of city center, your home base. Sometimes you might not. I'd recommend a reroll if you don't. I've almost always found that I do. The next step will be to plot out this territory. There'll be unknown question marks about. Some of them will be villages of locals. We'll look to take over these villages, and we might need some military to do so. Generally, I recommend people build 2 of their basic warrior units. In this case, we have a trooper, 10% power for each bonus received from an allied unit. I might look to get a more varied approach to start with, though, and I am kind of a fan of the trooper ranged approach. The ranger has a combat benefit that it applies if it's attacking the same target as other units, so potentially we can get a little bit of fun and flavor here. Now, you should always beeline towards the Spice, first of all. It is by far and away the most important thing you should be tracking down in this game for loads of reasons, and I did cover them in my beginner's guide, a video where I really slowed down to describe all of these resources, what they mean, and how they define the world of Dune. In this video, I'm more focused on strategy, on tips and tricks, on how you can do it well and master it, rather than just simply understanding it. The next step, now that I've got 2 units, is to identify a weak village nearby with Spice. Hey, look, here's one. The key you want to be looking out for, is particularly in this early game, is how many militia units are present. You want to try and match that with your power. Heading in underpowered is not a great idea. I've also noticed my scout has gone on to sort of this really frustrating hit the spacebar because it's doing nothing. Keep an eye out for this flashing clock symbol, by the way. It will apply to your harvesters, more on them later, and also your scouts. Basically, it's doing nothing. I'm going to put it on auto recon. That will force it to go around and research literally every little unknown thing to try and figure out what the world has, where the villages are. The other thing you could do before you put it on auto recon, though, is manually click it around like I'm going to do here. This is a second strategy that I quite like, and I think I'm going to start doing more and more moving forward. It helps us plot out unknown or unusable territories like this deep desert that I just don't want to move through because supply will murder me. But also it helps me find where the close villages are to my capital, to my main center. If you can get them close enough, you can start to get some cool adjacencies going on, where perhaps district defenses might be able to be shared across multiple villages. A close village is also obviously closer for you to take. It makes sense because you have to travel a lot, well, maybe somewhat less distance. Sand, of course, is our biggest enemy on the planet of Arrakis. We'll talk more about that in a minute. For now, I would recommend, regardless of the faction you're playing, that you move hard and fast to take the Spice. I've actually mucked around a little bit too long here. It should really be the first thing that you click towards. If we talk about Dune Spice Wars combat a little bit, Some units, like my ranger here, does have extra power. Allied units attacking the same target gain plus 5%. So I want to make sure that we're fighting the same target. We're also taking advantage of my base here and its missile defenses that are built in. We can build some of these manually later on our villages as well. But here, by far and away, you can see, thanks to the proximity to my base, I could almost complete this in one. But no! A worm! Get out of there! We're a little far away. I should have ran this unit here. We need to try and get from the desert and into the solid sandstone where the worm won't be able to bump out and fight me. Now, in this case, it was unable to eat me, so haha, shame on you. The threat has gone away, and I can bring my units back. Or has it? Perhaps we do a test on this unit for this video. Oh, there it goes! Don't leave your units undefended, or they will be swallowed whole. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am, and thank you for your service. Other early game constructions, as I flee this unit out of the way, also not looking to be a test subject and hopefully capturing this village, is to make sure that you're building the appropriate number of extra units. Generally, you'll want 2 scouts at the very least. There's some value, particularly if you're not playing as the Freeman and you don't have a counselor who reveals all of the spice locations on the map from the very start of the game. That one could be worth a look in. There is potentially some value in having more than 2. I'm going to build one here, start queuing that up. I'd also like to have at least 2 military units in the early game at all time, preferably 3, but 2 will do, as you can tell, so we'll queue up those extra units. The reason why I'm queuing up an extra scout, you might think, well, why? You don't need to. You've only just built this. You've got other places to take. There are a couple of reasons. Firstly, it'll help me find that spice, as I said before. Secondly, scouts or ornithopters can also engage with researchers or kind of goody hearts around the map. We'll probably reveal some of those later. This could be one right here. It could be a crash site of an ornithopter from days gone by. It could be loads of things. And it can net you resources from spice to plascrete to build developments to extra units and often extra scouting units. And that is a top tip that you should take away. Use your scouts to try and produce more. Try and get around 3 or 4. Just take note, of course, that they will be burning fuel. You don't want to burn too much. Hitting the pause button to quickly jump into the development screen. Once you take your first village, this will unlock. This is the tech tree. I'd like to share a couple of quick technologies that I've found very helpful. Firstly, composite materials is great. You can build improvements on your villages much faster. Beeline down through here, and you'll also be able to assign extra crews to your spice harvesters, upping your yield by up to around 50% once you max them out. Other key branches to move through could be the survival training over here. If you need more of a military, if you're aiming to take villages aggressively, or you need extra defensive units, you can move through here to ground command, giving you extra combat points. These, if you haven't seen my previous beginner's guide, I won't dwell on them too much here, but basically it's a cap on how many units you can build. You can also move through to high command to get that. 2 other things I'd like to note here. Some of the early techs up here are quite valuable. Local dialect lets you annex villages faster if you're going for that militaristic route. Local hubs for the extra knowledge and science and research, maybe. On the intelligence network side, the one thing that I'd really like to note is the extra agents. We'll talk more about them in a minute, although they don't really feature too heavily in this sort of foundation building early game stages. And finally, do take note of your house symbol. You can see here there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 in each category. Special technologies. They're not necessarily all unique to me. They may already exist, and some of the benefits may be able to be harvested by other factions, but there's always something unique to me, at the very least. Here you can see Atreides merchants. Great way to make a lot of money off my Siege barbarian allies. As I hinted at the start of the video, there are different ways and different factions and different powers to take advantage of. Moving your troops around, as was evident before, is a little dangerous in these parts, particularly over the sand. Now, the Freemen have some extra abilities. If you're playing as them here, you could use your worms to teleport you around the map effectively, using the Thumper device. Or you can build air bases as well, airfields in your territories. Hitting the X button will let you see where your active airfields are, and you can excavate or shuttle out these units for $20 and fly them to another airfield. Generally not a focus in the early game, though. Here, the key focus is, of course, connecting spice. First and foremost, I need to build my refinery. Pretty important. Because this territory has no units defending it, I'm going to bring my army back here as well. I covered tips on early game defense in yesterday's tips and tricks video, so I won't dwell on it here again, but militia are your friends. They are 1/4 of the cost, generally, of standard military units, and they don't take up those command points over here that we were talking about earlier as well. So you can get some real benefits out of them, but only defensively. You can't manually control them. They'll come out to fight if rebels or an AI opponent turns up, but other than that, they're not going to help your chief. Generally, always a good idea to have them in territories where you've built a lot of buildings and developments, or of course, where you're trying to connect this crucial spice. I am playing as the Atreides, and so I have this ability on villages, peaceful annexation. The smugglers can look to villages, particularly enemy ones, and build hidden underground hideouts to extract some of their resources or booby trap them. In my case, I can annex them peacefully. So, at the cost of some of my influence and water and authority, like would normally be the case, I can annex this village. The only downside is it takes a hot minute, folks. Some 15 days. Might be time to up the game speed to 2x so we can pass through these current date days a little bit quicker. At this point, my 2 military units are kind of just standing around costing me things. They're costing me water, they're costing me money, and unless they're defending this territory, they're not doing much. I'm going to help this territory defend itself so that I can send them off to take more villages by force. That way I can take advantage of my innate ability and also take some extras along the way. To make sure that this place is well defended, I could look to build the missile battery, one of the most powerful defensive districts in the game. But take care building it early on. You might want to slow down your ambitions. You might not want to follow in my lead here. Reason being is that their upkeep is relatively high. 3 manpower, 6 plastic, and 6 money, or solari and plascrete if we're describing it properly, is kind of a high upkeep. Not gonna lie, it would basically bankrupt me. So actually, let's reconsider our plan here. We've got the 2 militia coming online soon. For the meantime, I need to build up my base economy a little bit first. Best ways to do this are the plascrete factory. It produces at least 30 plascrete and only costs an upkeep of 6, so it's basically a free build. Other early builds that I quite like but don't super love are those missile batteries for defense. And then if you have access to any special resources, like this village here, for example, will gain access to minerals for extra plascrete production, then you might want to focus on those too. The good news is over here on our final or first frontier, Fontar, we've got our harvester online now that we've got this crucial refinery hooked up. First things first, I'm going to use my extra manpower. Another reason to try and save it up and not waste all of it on your military units, right? I'm going to spend it here to add an extra crew to this harvester. It'll add about an extra 5 spice, put it up to around 20. Next, I'm going to need to deploy it. Again, keep an eye out for units. Doing nothing over on the right-hand side here. So I'll deploy this, and then I'm also going to put it on auto recall. As we witnessed before, the desert is a dangerous place. I can't always be here, particularly playing on 2x speed and time to remove and recall this harvester, so I'm going to leave it there. If you're playing as anyone other than the Freeman, this will be the situation for you. If you're playing as the Freeman, you harvest your spice a little differently, and you won't need to worry about giant worms jumping out because you're not using giant, heavy, loud machines. The next step for me here is to kind of think about, okay, what's next? So I've got 1 spice connected. I'd like to get it more defended. There are more steps to play out here in the early game, though. Next thing is obviously I need more villages. I've got 1 being peacefully annexed, and my units, as I say, standing around costing me a lot of money and literally achieving nothing, need to start moving towards another place. Unfortunately, both of these ones in range have 3 units defending them. I only have 2. That suggests to me that it might be time to save up a little bit of money and get a 3rd unit so that we can crack through. I generally recommend as well, by the way, my tips that have serviced me well, you'll want to have a standing army of at least 2 to 4 military units in this early game period, where hegemony, the sort of score and ranking system, is still relatively low, below that first crucial 2,000 and especially below the 5,000 threshold. And everything's relatively peaceful. You're unlikely to be fighting the AI at this point. However, we are starting to be introduced to the other 2 systems in this game, so let me quickly share my early game tips for those 2. Espionage is first. Agents, my ones are particularly powerful, don't forget, because of the way that I set up this faction at the start, have promotions that can give them different things. This guy's a recruiter who has faster agent recruiting speed. Brilliant. I will not dismiss you. You can stay. Where you place them will impact your yields and resources. On the left-hand side, you can infiltrate other houses in the game, earning you intel to buy these operations. These are kind of like one-time use abilities. This one increases supply drain on an enemy. This one reduces their power in a region. I can spend intel generated at 5 a day, depending on how many people I have infiltrating the other bases, to carry out some espionage operations. The ones in the later game, and I have a video talking about victory conditions that I'm working really hard on. I'm going to try and have it produced either today or tomorrow. But in the later game, these operations can literally win you the game through powerful things like assassinating heads of other factions. It's very strong. Your other option for assigning your agents is to put them in sort of other organizations, institutions around the world. You can infiltrate Arrakis itself for authority, get manpower from the Space and Gould, money from the Chome, and influence from the Laandsard. Because I'm playing as one of the two factions that benefits from voting and influence with the Laandsard, which I'll show you now, I might choose to infiltrate Arrakis first, or get this intel online and infiltrate my nearest neighbor. Now, the council is the second part of this that I'd like to introduce to you, and it will be open for resolutions in 5 days. One of the key resources I'm going to need to focus on before I start training new units and figuring out how to take these districts is water as well. I should have enough authority to take them, but I won't have enough water. Look, this village is consuming 5 water. I don't have it. So I'm going to look at wind strength in the areas that I do have. Fight this rebel that's walking past for a little bit of military strength on the way. Try and get the ranged unit out of dodge. Not that it matters because he's so weak. Far, far, far. And then look to build water. This is a dreadful district for water. Absolutely awful. Its wind strength is only 2. The wind strength number is multiplied generally by 3, and that's how much water the wind trap will produce. It's not great. I do need one built eventually. I noticed that this village here, which will be connected in 3 days, has double the wind strength. So I'm going to hold off on my expansion plans, and instead look to build up my base resources. A maintenance center could actually be a reasonable grab as I look to start to build a whole load of things adjacent to this territory, right? This territory potentially has in future 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 districts adjacent. So building a building like the maintenance center that reduces upkeep here and within neighboring regions up to 1 is very powerful. So do keep that in mind, that sort of very Northgard-inspired element to sort of base building survival that takes place in Dune Spice Wars. And through the magic of television now, 5 days has passed. Let's talk about the Laandsard Council and how I handle it in the early game in particular. The charters up the top aren't to be worried about at this point. Early game resolutions are powerful, but nowhere near as strong as some of the late game ones. Generally speaking, if you're playing as Atreides or Vlad, you'll have votes to spend. The neutral people as well also have a lot, so getting them on side could be helpful later in the game. You'll also be able to spend influence on votes. Anybody can earn influence by building developments or researching it in the tech tree, but as one of the 2 current houses in the game that really pay their taxes to the Laandsard, we're interested in our Emperor, our Overlord. I'm also interested in keeping this standing high. Part of that is achieved by paying my taxes. Keeping this standing high will give me extra votes. Combined with my influence, I should be able to win some resolutions. Generally speaking, there's one particular resolution in the early game that awards you units. If you can get free units out of these things, it's very good. Otherwise, generally, play to your strengths, I find, is the best thing to do. And don't be afraid to spend your votes. They are entirely free to you, so you might as well. You could choose to stockpile influence for future decisions. I like to do that personally, or to trade it with other people. Sometimes they'll pay a pretty price, but you might as well spend all of your votes, whether it's to sabotage your opponents by reducing overall influence generation like this one, or making everyone a little bit more wealthy. These early game benefits tend to impact everybody, and as you go through, they become more specific and more targeted. My peacefully captured village is online, noting again its high wind strength. I need to start getting some water so that we can fuel further expansion. I also need more water because I'm training an extra unit, and as a reminder, they cost upkeep. The council is open for votes for many in-game days, and so sometimes you can earn more influence as it goes through. You might want to come back and revisit it and add extra votes if you need to. The next, and perhaps final really core thing that you should be focused on in the early game is grabbing as much of the close spice as you can. You need to try and beat the AI to it ideally, because villages that are housed by locals with militia are weak. They tend to not have any kind of defenses aside from their basic militia, and if you can outnumber them, you can beat them. In fact, I'm about to head over right now and put my money where my mouth is and try and take this village. Why this one? Well, it's got a place creep resource, which is nice, but more importantly, and what I was about to say, the key here in the later game stages of the early game, lol, is to try and connect spice. I've found 2 within vision range that are currently not occupied or at least at threat by other players. We have this village here, Dude, and then we have this village here, Sinmara. Sinmara is strong and difficult. I might use my special ability here, and this is where using the strengths of your house come through. Don't forget to ride the worms if you're playing as the Freeman, and don't forget to passively annex if you're playing as the Atreides. This will, of course, be hard to defend because it's far away from me, so there is a risk involved. However, generally speaking, not terrible. Honestly, not terrible. I'm going to jump for it and grab it, and then I'm going to use my military units to try and push through this way and take these ones. Connecting 2 spice in the early game is really good. If you can connect 3, you'll be away and laughing. There are a couple of interesting things that are happening in this combat that I really want to show you. Firstly is unit attrition and health, and secondly is a worm. So my unit attrition is being worn down here as I'm fighting out in the sand, not in my territory. The orange bar, as this decreases, as their supply decreases, they won't be able to regenerate their health as much. It puts them in a really vulnerable space where basically they just have no food and they'll perish. So I need to make sure that I'm at least on the sandstone or fighting the city rather than standing around doing nothing. So the first thing to do here would be to bring them a little closer. The next thing that I want to show you, and unfortunately I'm going to sacrifice one of them to the cause here, is the worms. The danger of the worm. So this guy's going to take the village, and this guy is going to be a test subject. If you're fighting, if you're caught off guard, if you're not watching, or if you're moving around loudly in the desert like most of us do, you could be at threat of a sandworm. They will harvest your harvesters because they love to do that, and they'll swallow you whole. Yikes. Take care out there. As you start to expand and pick up more places, generally, I like to shoot for the plastic factory. This one is in particularly powerful, of course, because I have this resource in this territory, minerals, plus 50% plastic factory resource production. It's always a good idea if you can to beeline towards these resources and the spice, and you can kind of leave the rest alone unless you need the spots in the village for yield, or if you have your army standing around doing nothing and not defending against all of these red threats. The plastic production is generally just a great one to go for, though. Its upkeep is what it produces, and it produces more than it costs to upkeep. A great district to build, providing you're keeping up with your manpower and your water. Go for gold, baby. Over here, my militia are staging a pretty good defense. I haven't built a very powerful missile silo here yet, although I'd like to show you that just briefly. They power up generally as the game goes on, but they're not bad. Thankfully, we have a missile coming out of our city center already, so all good, nicely defended. Some of the real power that comes out of these, of course, is their range. Their cost is unduly expensive, potentially, in the early game, but if you can reduce their cost with districts, they become more affordable. Placing it at a spot like this, again, gets that double effect. This missile battery has effectively had its cost reduce, because now it's shielding 2 villages. I'm kind of getting twice the value out of it, if you will. Another option, of course, would be to replot it. I don't need the manpower buildings, so I can ignore those and try and get it in range of 3. Look at that! It's just able to protect this village, potentially. It can protect my spice, which is most important. Let's get an extra militia in here so that we're ready for next time. And it can protect the capital as well. Not a bad start. You can also use the missile batteries offensively. Here's a district I want to take. I don't need to build one here because it's a random one with random dudes. But if it was an AI faction or a multiplayer faction, whenever multiplayer is added to this game, you can bet your backside I'd be building missiles here. Heaps of time to pay my taxes. I don't need to worry about my standing with the council. We've almost got their next payment ready. I don't need to worry about the implications that not paying my taxes has on my water or my money or my authority, causing more rebels to appear and destroying me. It leads to a downward spiral. Thankfully, this time we're okay. So I can afford to just play with the slider a bit, keeping an eye on it as I go to not fall too below on spice, and make a little bit more money out of it as well. This is the very powerful vote. 3 Laandsard guards, units that don't suffer any negative penalties. If you have the ability, I'd recommend you grab this. This will help your early expansion like there's no tomorrow. And if you take any tip or trick from this video, maybe it could be this one. This is by far and away the cheapest way to build up an early military. Easily. And a pretty effective one at that. You'll get units that are slightly stronger, in this case than my troopers, and they won't suffer any negative ills.
On duty. Attack!
Either way, I have 2 units ready to crucially connect what I consider to be the most important part of the early game. 2 spice. Obviously, I want it all. I'll take 3. I'll take 4. 3 seems doable in the early game, this period before you get to, or before anyone gets to, around sort of 3,000 hegemony. You are in danger of a worm. I don't need to test that twice for you this time, so I'll refrain from doing that. And we'll secure this factory. This village, which will have a factory, will provide me with spice once I get it online, so there's this one done. And then you might remember from earlier on in the video, I'm using my peaceful annexation to get this one connected as well. Before I do that though, and seeing as I have so much money and plastic at the minute, I'm going to quickly build a missile defense here. And because I took it over peacefully, it's kept its militia. That's kind of handy because I don't have to train any, kind of a freebie. And again, a really good trade-off for their cost, which was only a little bit of influence. Get the missile battery online, then I'll start harvesting the spice. I just don't want to be vulnerable. If you want to play it a little more aggressive, you totally can. And with the connection of extra spice, the building of defenses, and the awkward waiting for me to get 1 extra authority, wham, to take this, I have 3 spices basically connected. My free units have appeared, which I'm going to send off on an absolute rampage. I care less about these units because they'll disappear in 20 days. So let's send them out. Take some villages, build some water, and conclude what I consider to be the early game in Dune Spice Wars. We've hit 2,000 hegemony. We can start to build more powerful upgrades districts on our center now, and probably we're going to start to come in contact with other players too. Thank you very much for watching my early game tips for Dune Spice Wars, and I'll see you in the next one.